When Jack Harrison woke up at 3:23 a.m. to a terrible sound that came from the depths of his house, he was not surprised. These sounds had been his constant companion for 3 weeks now. It all started with the usual knocking at night, which could be attributed to the wind, but then the sounds became more and more strange. Footsteps in the hallway, the creak of doors opening, rustling, as if someone was moving around the house. Jack was a rational man. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or the paranormal. For him, every problem had a logical explanation, and these sounds had to have a reason too. He searched for answers for a long time. I spent several nights in vigil, going around the house with a flashlight, checking windows and doors, but found nothing. Neighbors claimed that no one could get into his house. Their neighborhood was quiet, even boring. But the sounds continued. It all started a few days before when he found a strange note under his front door. It read, "You don't sleep alone." Jack thought it was some kind of stupid joke by teenagers from the next block, and just threw the piece of paper away. But from that moment on, his nights turned into hell. Every night he woke up with the feeling that someone else was in the house, and this thought gradually drove him crazy. He began to fall asleep during the day, sitting in the office, passing out right at his desk. His bosses reprimanded him, and his colleagues looked at him with pity. Jack didn't know which was worse, his own exhaustion or the fact that he was on the verge of being fired. His body needed sleep, but every night he woke up. Sometimes it seemed that he did not even fall asleep, but simply turned off for a few minutes to be woken up again by an unknown noise. In the 3rd week of insomnia, Jack installed cameras all over the house. He needed proof. He should have realized that this was just a figment of his imagination. The cameras recorded everything: his sleep, the empty corridors, the sleeping blocks outside the windows. But one morning, while reviewing the notes, Jack noticed something strange. Every time he woke up in the middle of the night, there was something indistinguishable on the camera screen. Something like a shadow that flickered next to his bed, but disappeared before it was possible to determine exactly what it was. His brain was on the verge of burning out, and Jack couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Someone was in his house, invisible, intangible, but clearly present. The thought terrified him, and every night he was less and less able to resist exhaustion. Deprived of sleep, he could not distinguish reality from sleep. One cold November evening, Jack decided to take drastic measures. He invited his best friend Tom, whom he trusted more than anyone in the world. Tom was a former military man and didn't believe in the paranormal any more than Jack did. His firm character and ability to remain calm in any situation should have helped Jack solve this nightmare once and for all. They locked the doors and windows, checked every room in the house, and sat down in the kitchen to drink coffee. Jack told him everything about the sounds, the notes, the shadows he had seen on the recordings. Tom, grinning, suggested that this was the result of accumulated fatigue and stress. They decided to have a night watch and see what would happen. By midnight, nothing was happening. The silence in the house was almost painful, except for the clock ticking on the wall and the wind whistling outside the window. Jack began to nod off, while Tom, on the contrary, cheerfully walked around the house, joking from time to time that he was ready for any eventuality. However, at 2:47 a.m., they heard the first sound, the sharp creak of the attic door. Jack and Tom exchanged glances. The door to the attic was always closed. No one opened it. Tom grabbed a flashlight and nodded to Jack to follow him. They walked slowly up the stairs. Every step echoed in the silence. When they reached the attic door, Tom took hold of the handle and pulled it. The door opened with a slight creak, as if it had not been opened for a long time. The darkness in the attic was impenetrable. Tom turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the back of the room. At first, nothing was visible, just old boxes and dust-covered pieces of furniture. But suddenly, Jack noticed movement in the far corner. Where the ray of light did not reach, it seemed that something moved. "Did you see that?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling. "Quiet," Tom replied, and began to move slowly towards the shadow. The closer they got, the colder the room became. The air around them seemed to thicken, becoming sticky like syrup. Jack felt goosebumps running down his spine, but he couldn't take his eyes off the place where the shadow was. And suddenly, without warning, Tom stopped and froze. His flashlight fell to the floor, and at that moment, Jack realized that his friend was no longer the same as he used to be. Tom stood motionless, his eyes wide open but not seeing. His breathing became shallow and his hands were shaking. Jack grabbed his shoulder, trying to pull him out of his stupor, but Tom didn't move. "Tom, are you okay?" Jack asked, but there was no answer. Jack frantically continued to shake Tom's shoulder, his heart pounding with fear and anxiety. He felt like his friend was literally petrified, as if someone had pulled the life out of him, leaving only a motionless body. Jack's mind was whirling with thoughts. He did not understand what could have changed his friend's condition so dramatically. At the same moment, he felt a cold stream of air hit his face, as if someone had opened a window, although he was sure that everything was closed. Trying to hold back his panic, Jack grabbed the flashlight that had fallen out of Tom's hands and shone its light to where the shadow was still swaying in the corner of the room. There was an old cupboard right in front of him, covered with a layer of dust, and Jack suddenly realized that this piece of furniture had not been there before. A few weeks ago, during the cleaning, he went up to the attic and did not see this closet. Thoughts of possible explanations flooded in, but none of them seemed logical. "Damn it, Tom. Wake up," Jack hissed, shaking his friend again. No response. Jack felt a buzz building in his head. Panic began to creep closer, but it could still be controlled. He took a step back, deciding to go downstairs, when suddenly he heard a faint movement behind him. Jack froze. There was a barely audible hoarse sound in the air, as if someone had inhaled deeply. At that moment, Jack realized they weren't alone in the attic. A sharp, screeching sound came from where the closet was located. It seemed as if something heavy was scratching the wooden floor. Wasting no time, Jack aimed the flashlight beam at the closet. The closet doors were ajar, and a strange vibration emanated from the crack, accompanied by muffled sounds like a wheeze and a whisper at the same time. "Are you there?" A whisper escaped Jack's lips that he didn't realize. There was no response, just the continued grinding inside. Unable to stay in the waiting state any longer, Jack made up his mind and went to the closet. He jerked the door handle sharply, ready for something terrible to meet him. But there was nothing outside the door except old clothes piled high with boxes. However, the sound did not disappear. It continued to come from somewhere deeper. Jack looked closer and noticed that the back wall of the closet was slightly raised, as if there was something behind it that he had not seen before. "It's impossible," flashed through his mind, but curiosity overcame fear. Jack carefully lifted the back wall and found something that made his blood run cold. Behind the closet wall was a narrow passage leading down, right into the interior of the house, as if there was some hidden part that no one knew about. He illuminated the passage with a flashlight, but the depth went further than the light could reach. Jack looked at Tom in confusion, who was still standing motionless, as if his mind had been completely disconnected. He took a deep breath, realizing that there was no turning back. If he doesn't figure out what's going on, these nightmares won't stop. The way was clear. We had to go down into this passage and find out what the hell was hiding there. Jack stepped into the aisle and began to slowly move down. The air grew colder and denser with every step. Through the gloom, he began to see the outlines of strange symbols on the walls, as if someone had scratched them out with nails in ancient times. Footsteps echoed in this narrow tunnel, and each sound cut through the silence, increasing his anxiety. He went deeper down and stopped at the door. The small wooden door was covered with strange markings, but it didn't seem as old as everything around it. Jack listened carefully. Someone was whispering outside the door. It's not clear if these were human voices or sounds that his mind couldn't rationalize. Jack slowly opened the door and saw a room lit by the dim light of a candle. There was a table in the center of the room with a stack of old papers on it. Jack cautiously approached the table. Each paper had short, jerky phrases written in different handwriting. "They're watching me. I hear them every night. It's not a dream. They're here." Suddenly, Jack realized that he wasn't the only one who had faced this nightmare. The people who lived here before him also experienced something similar. But who were they? And most importantly, where did they disappear to? Looking around the room, Jack noticed strange stains on the floor, as if someone was dragging something heavy on wooden planks. Blood. He bent down to take a closer look at them, and at that moment something touched his shoulder. Turning sharply, Jack saw Tom. Only now it wasn't the Tom he knew. Tom's face was distorted into a terrible grimace. His eyes were empty, and he was holding a hammer in his hands, which he probably took along the way. "You shouldn't have come here," Tom whispered, his voice sounding hollow, as if he were saying the words through a layer of cloth. "They made me. You're next." Jack froze. His brain couldn't comprehend what was happening. Tom slowly raised the hammer, and Jack realized that he didn't have time to think. He lunged to the side, avoiding the blow. The hammer crashed into the table with a thud, destroying the papers, which instantly scattered around the room. Jack grabbed the nearest chair and threw it at Tom, trying to buy some time. But Tom didn't stop. His movements were abrupt and unnatural, as if he was under someone's control. Jack rushed back to the door, trying to get out of this dungeon. But to his horror, the passage behind him was closed. Jack frantically tried to find a way out, but the passage through which he had come was now tightly locked, as if it had never existed. His heart was pounding in his chest and his ears were buzzing. Tom, his best friend, was standing nearby with a hammer in his hands, like a puppet in someone else's hands, getting closer with every step. "Tom, it's me, Jack," he shouted, hoping to reach the mind of his friend, who seemed to be trapped somewhere deep inside this altered body. But Tom did not answer. His face remained expressionless, his eyes glittered with a dead emptiness. He walked closer and closer, his movements became even more aggressive. Jack instinctively rushed to the wall, trying to somehow detain him or find something to protect him. Suddenly, his fingers touched a cold metal object, a rusty iron scrap that was lying among the trash in the corner. There was no time to think. Tom was already too close. Jack grabbed the crowbar and, with a force he hadn't known he possessed until that moment, directed it towards his friend, who ruthlessly swung the hammer. There was a dull thud as the crowbar crashed into Tom's body. But he didn't stop. The hammer slid across Jack's shoulder, tearing the fabric and leaving a deep wound. Pain shot through him, but Jack didn't give up. He knew that if he stopped for even a second, it would be the end of him. He turned around and hit Tom on the head with a crowbar with renewed force. This time, the blow was accurate. Tom hesitated, the hammer fell out of his hands, and he collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Jack knelt down, breathing heavily. His body was shaking and blood was flowing from the wound, but he was still alive. But it wasn't over yet. A low but ominous whisper came from the back of the room. He wasn't alone. Jack turned slowly and saw figures begin to emerge from the corners of the room, from the shadows that had previously been hidden from his eyes. The faces of these creatures were distorted with pain and horror. They weren't human, but they might have been once. They were moving towards him, arms outstretched as if trying to capture him, as they had captured Tom. Desperately clutching at the last remnants of his strength, Jack rushed to the door. He no longer felt pain, only despair. He couldn't let these creatures take him away. With a shout, he hit the door with a crowbar, and it flew open with a bang. Running out of the room, Jack didn't look back. He raced down the narrow aisle, hearing footsteps approaching behind him. All he had to do was run. The air in the hallway was thick and heavy. His every breath felt like his last. Suddenly, he stumbled and his legs gave way. Jack collapsed to the floor. The crowbar flew out of his hands, and paralyzing fear gripped his body. He tried to stand up, but his foot caught on something in the floor, and then he realized the terrible truth. His leg was wrapped in a noose that he hadn't noticed before.